to escalate. I want to bring in my guests. We're joined with the one and only Scott Ritter. Scott Ritter is the perfect person to talk to today. It's just so happened that you said yes, and just so happened this happened overnight. Scott, let me bring you in. Scott Ritter is a former UN weapons inspector and weapons of mass destruction whistleblower. You can follow Scott on Telegram at Scott Ritter. How you doing this morning, Scott? You doing all right?
I'm doing well, thank you. Yourself?
I am doing okay, a bit freaked out and a bit concerned at the events that are taking place. Let's start at the beginning. I listened to your talk on the issue for Joe Biden, and I agree with you. I agree with you 1,000%. Up to this point, every action that Putin has taken that has been pragmatic has been accepted or is seen through this lens of weakness. He's bluffing, he's weak, despite the fact that what they've been doing was trying to prevent a larger war. Joe Biden, on his way out, despite democratically failed, gets lame duck, and on his way out decides to escalate in a way that Putin has defined as being a red line. Why is Joe Biden doing this? Is it the innocent answer of, well, he's doing this for posterity, so in 1,000 years when they look back, they can say, well, he did everything he could to keep Ukraine in the Western sphere of influence? Or is it the more cynical reason of, we are going to pull Ukraine as far into NATO, let's say, ideals and contexts in this next 2 months? Basically, we are going to accelerate this notion of ingratiating NATO or NATO tactics into Ukraine. What is it? Why is Joe Biden doing this now?
Well, first of all, I don't know if Joe Biden's doing anything now. He's clearly a diminished man. Whether or not he is capable of the cognitive processes required to make complex national security decision making is a legitimate question that everybody should be asking. What we do know is that there was a split in his administration about this very issue, whether or not to allow Ukraine to use U.S. provided ATACMS missiles to strike targets in Russia. We know that back in September, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin articulated very strongly against this policy, understanding that these weapons would not contribute to a Ukrainian victory. Ukraine was still going to lose this war. As Austin said, the only way out of this conflict is through negotiation, and also the recognition that by doing so, this could lead to an escalation, the consequences of which are unpredictable. Secretary of State Tony Blinken had a different approach. There was an approach that I think even in September, prior to the election, was premised on the fear of a Trump victory and the need for the United States to do something that protected NATO and Ukraine from a potential Trump administration. And what they needed to do is get NATO and Ukraine so closely entwined together, in effect, to make Ukraine a de facto member of NATO with NATO military presence on the soil, etc., that a Donald Trump administration would not be able to come in and mess that up. The idea was to Trump-proof NATO, Trump-proof Ukraine. In order to do that, you would have to implement policies that represented a radical departure from past practice, policies that are reflected in the Zelensky 10-point peace plan that he has put out there. The first measure of which is give us long-range weapons. The next thing he's going to ask for, if you give Ukraine long-range weapons and once again Russia does nothing, the next thing is to say, well, we're going to extend NATO air defense into Western Ukraine, allow Patriot missiles out of Poland to shoot down Russian missiles as they come in to Ukrainian territory. And then the next step would be to put NATO aircraft over Ukraine to engage Russian missiles and cruise missiles. This is what Zelensky is asking for. And then this inevitably leads to boots on the ground, a military presence And now NATO is in Ukraine, and Ukraine is a de facto member of NATO. This is Trump proofing 101. It's also a recipe for disaster because it actually takes us down the path of meeting the conditions set by Russia for the use of nuclear weapons. Now, up until now, the West, the Blinkens of the world are saying that Russia is bluffing, that Putin is bluffing, and that's why they can do this. I think today Putin showed that he's not bluffing. He warned that if you use these weapons, these ATACMS missiles, which even the Russians say, it doesn't change anything. Ukraine fired 6. 5 were shot down. 1 got hit in the air, broke up coming in, did some damage. That's not the point. The point is Russia understands the escalation that's taking place, that if you don't nip this in the bud now, the next thing you know, you have Poland saying they're going to extend their air defense. And now you have a bigger crisis. So the time to act is now, and that's what they've done. They've fired a missile, which under certain configurations could be classified as an intercontinental ballistic missile. Under other configurations is an intermediate range missile. But the bottom line is, for the first time in the history of war, I'll say it one more time, for the first time in the history of war, an ICBM has been fired in combat. And there's nothing the West can do. They can't stop it. They can't shoot it down. And it used a warhead. I think when the battle damage assessment comes in, the warhead type that was used, which we had not, I've been following this for a long time. Maybe people in the Pentagon who have access to the top secret information, had a clue that this was up. But most discussions had this missile, which is called the RS-26 Rubz, or Frontier. It wasn't RS-24. The Rubz is actually the first 2 stages of the RS-24. The RS-24 is a 3-stage ICBM. The Rubz uses the first 2 stages of it. We had thought it either has a nuclear warhead, or it could have 3 avant-garde, which was what you were showing there, the avant-garde hypersonic reentry vehicles. But nowhere have I read that it could have a conventional payload of up to 6 cassette-type warheads. That meaning, when I say that, each one of these 6 warheads has 6 submunitions in it. So there's 36 total, munitions striking the ground at very high speed with extreme accuracy, bringing a lot of damage in a very isolated place. This wasn't on my radar, and I don't know if it was on anybody's radar who didn't have access to, the most sensitive intelligence information in the United States. And I'm even wondering if the United States was aware that this warhead type was available for the Rubz. The Russians did this, sending a signal that they can strike anywhere in Europe, anytime they want, with non-nuclear power that will destroy whatever target it's aimed at. There's no target safe from the Rubz. The Russians just told the Poles, hey, you just activated that anti-ballistic missile site, the Mark 41 Aegis ashore. It's dead, and it's not going to require a nuclear weapon to do it. We'll just put a Rubz on it, and it's das Vidanya. Putin has been warning about this for some time. I've been tracking this. Back in the summer, Putin appeared to restart the Rubz production line in Votkhinsk. The Rubz was developed in 2015, scheduled to come online in 2017, but because it has the ability to be classified as either an intercontinental ballistic missile or an intermediate range missile, the Russians decided not to go forward because they would have to commit to a warhead type for this weapon under the terms of the START treaty, because the INF treaty, which was still the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was signed in 1987, implemented in 88. I was an Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty weapons inspector. In fact, the first one on the ground in the Soviet Union to implement this treaty, a very important treaty. And that treaty prohibited uh, missiles like the Rubz that was fired the other day. But Donald Trump withdrew from the INF treaty in 2019, and the Russians said, "We have no intention of, even though you withdrew from it, we're not going to build new INF type systems unless you deploy INF type systems to Europe." And unfortunately for the world, the United States did just that. We deployed intermediate range systems in a training exercise in Denmark. And the Russians said, okay. And they opened up the Rubz production lines. This was sometime in July. Based upon my past experience there and such, the rate of production of a Rubz, if brought into full scale production, which the Russians were prepared to do, it's about 6 to 8 missiles a month. And in the time frame, that means they could have produced between 36 and 40 of these missiles, and they're still producing them. So Russia has a sufficient arsenal of these missiles right now ready to take out all of Europe without nuclear weapons, to destroy Kiev, to take out any target they want. They hadn't used these because this represents a qualitative advance in the war, and Russia was avoiding that. But Russia said, if you use these ATACMS missiles, if you use the Storm Shadow, the Scalp against Russian targets, that's a qualitative advancement, and we will respond. And they're not going to respond in kind. Russia just put down the biggest warning you have. This is the first time, I just want your audience to understand that an ICBM has been fired in combat in the history of the world. And the Russians just did it, and there's not a damn thing anybody can do to stop that weapon. And now they have a bunch of them, and it's game on. Will the West learn its lesson? Will the West back down and understand that you're not going to save Ukraine, that Ukraine has lost this war, and the best way out of this crisis is to get Ukraine to the negotiating table as soon as possible to bring an end to this conflict? Or they can continue to deceive themselves into believing that they can push Russia to the point where Russia breaks, that Putin is bluffing. Today proved Putin's not bluffing. And I will tell you this, if we continue, the Rubz will be used again and again and again to take out targets in Ukraine that will become increasingly painful for the Ukrainians and for us. And if we continue to push, then they will take out targets in Europe.
Well, that's the other catch. This is also capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, which is also the other, I would imagine, warning that is being issued. I mean, you get the changing of the nuclear guidelines or the nuclear policy, and then you get a missile, ICBM, first time ever fired, capable of carrying a nuclear warhead on top of that. I don't necessarily think those things are separate from one another. I don't think they're a coincidence. That has to be part of the message that is being sent using this weapon, correct?
Look, they just published, they published the idea of a modified, updated nuclear posture, nuclear employment doctrine.
Right.
Putin discussed that back in September when he met with his leadership. He just signed that into law on November 19th.
Right.
And he has said straight up, if you attack us with these missiles, we can use nuclear weapons against you. And of course, now the United States has in effect attacked Russia with these weapons. These weapons could not be fired without American assistance, American direction, American permission. So from the Russian perspective, the United States has attacked Russia. And so now they have fired a weapon system, which you're 100% correct, is fully capable of carrying between 1 and 3 nuclear warheads. And I think Russia's putting the marker down, saying, this time we use conventional. We're fully capable of using nuclear weapons on this too. And if you want to keep pushing the envelope, we just told you what the doctrine is. It shouldn't come as a surprise if we, in fact, nuke you.
Well, that's what I was going to get at. Do you think after this demonstration, because my point of view the other day was that Russia is going to have to respond in a way that is significant enough to get across, we are serious and we are not messing around. Basically, it's almost like you have to be strong enough to get across that you're willing to end the world in order to get them to not continue to escalate. Otherwise, they take your weaknesses or your pragmatism as weakness. Do you think that they are going to And I guess this kind of depends on what Joe Biden's objective is, or whoever's running the show objective is. Is their objective ultimately war? Or is it that they're pushing the envelope, seeing to how far they can push without going over the cliff? This kind of brinksmanship. Where do you think they are on this? Meaning, do you think they take this demonstration for the seriousness that it deserves? And if they don't, what would be the next escalation from your point of view?
Well, let's start first of all with why Russia did what it did. I mean, they've introduced a dramatic new weapon. The
Right.
target they hit is a missile factory. The former Yuzhmash missile factory used to produce Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Ukrainians renamed it, and they produce missile-related technology. Right now, Ukraine is saying that they're producing their own ballistic missiles to be used to strike Russia. Well, they ain't going to be producing them at the Yuzhmash factory anymore. The Yuzhmash factory no longer exists because of what Russia just did. So, I mean, that was the signal that, look, we can do this. There had been hints that Russia would have used a weapon like that against Kiev, against Bankova Street, to take out the
Right.
Ukrainian government, but they did not. Instead, they struck a legitimate military target, which is in keeping with Russia's approach so far, which is not to, turn this into a nation-killing exercise.
Right.
But the next step will be to kill the Ukrainian government. And I think that's the message that needs to be played out here in the West, is that Russia just demonstrated the ability to take out the Ukrainian government using non-nuclear power. They did not do so because they're giving the West a chance to change its policy direction.
You're so right.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just
So,
going to say, you're so right.
but
Because
yeah,
if
I hope the West hears this message. I know there will be a debate in NATO.
yeah,
Hopefully, those who say Russia's bluffing no longer will say that, but there will be some who will say, "Well, they didn't hit Kiev though. They're scared. They hit
right.
Dnipropetrovsk. It's not the decisive step that they said. We still don't think that they'll follow through, and they may seek to escalate. But if they do that, what this has done is it built in an additional escalatory step that Russia can take before it has to attack Europe. But the next step will be to take out Kiev. And the next step after that will be to strike European targets. And then the next step after that is nuclear war. So we're literally 3 steps away from the world ending. Good morning, America.
Yeah. I mean, and people are talking about like Taylor Swift and all this other nonsense. And we are literally whistling past the graveyard. It also explains why the report came out saying that Kiev was going to be hit. I mean, because they shut down those embassies under this notion that Kiev is going to be hit. We close in our embassies. We don't want to take the chance of our employees being there. But if you're right, then the reason that they gave that heads up is you could be next. Effectively, this is what we hit, but we could have done that to Kiev if you keep pushing us. Wow. I guess my question is, where do you think the US is going to fall on this? Do you think that they're going to end up saying, well, we think they're bluffing? We don't think they have it in them to hit Kiev? And do you think that some of these people actually want the war, meaning want to provoke in a way that tries to get them to go further than just hitting it in Ukraine? How far do you think some of these people are willing to go?
Well, let's put it this way. The Rubz, the RS-26, is a road mobile system. It's
Right.
designed to be fired from, a non-observed location in the woods. It's not supposed to be detected. There's an element of surprise to this. The Ukrainians knew that the RS-26 was about to be fired because the Russians took it to Kapustin Yar outside of Astrakhan. Kapustin Yar is a missile test facility, and they put it on display.
Right.
They had it there, sitting there, oriented towards Ukraine, not towards the impact zone. So they brought the RS-26 out into the open, oriented it towards Ukraine for at least 24 to 48 hours so that the West could A, see it, and B, get all of their intelligence collection capabilities brought to bear. Because when Russia's going to launch a missile of this notion, you don't just want, the IR signal and all that stuff. You're going to want all of the telemetry, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's done to collect on this. And Russia wanted the West to see this, to observe it, to learn from it. They wanted everything so that when the missile was fired, the West saw all of the operational parameters of the missile. They saw the stage separation. They saw the post-push vehicle separation. They saw it maneuver. They saw it release. They did it. There's things that can happen in space that give us very close look at all this if, in fact, we deployed those systems. But my point is, Russia gave the American intelligence all of the opportunity in the world to collect every single piece of information they wanted. Why? Because Russia wants America to know what they're dealing with here. Russia, this wasn't a little sneak attack where Russia snuck in under the radar. They came out and said, boom, here we are. Boom, there it is. That's the direction we're firing. And bam, we did it. And I hope you collected everything so that the Pentagon, the CIA comes to Lloyd Austin and says, yep, we can't stop it. And then Lloyd Austin gets to go to Tony Blinken and slap him across the face and say, we can't stop it. And then somebody gets to go to Joe Biden, inject him with some sort of caffeine supplement. So he wakes up and says, boss, we can't stop it. It's war. And hopefully at that point in time, Biden doesn't nod off to sleep and he goes, let's get off this stupidity. Blinken, you gambled. Russia's not bluffing. We're not playing this freaking game. Bring it to an end. Call up NATO and say, stop the nonsense. Starmer, stand down. Macron, stand down. We're not going to world war over this, or we all die. But the Russians are doing everything humanly possible to make sure that the United States had every opportunity to collect every piece of technical intelligence about this missile launch so that there could be no doubt in anybody's mind what the West is facing here.
Right.
And it's an extraordinary move on the part of the Russians to do this, because we're talking about the Russians giving up
intelligence, surprise,
intelligence information, future surprise. So basically the Russians are saying, here is the RS-26 missile. Now, the bad news for America is, the good news is the Russians used a warhead I don't believe anybody was aware of. And so we learned a lot about this warhead. The bad news is we didn't learn anything about the avant-garde configuration or the nuclear weapon configuration, but that's okay. That's also good news. But so we didn't learn everything about this Rubz, but we did learn, and hopefully, again, I'd like to believe that, I'm not in the business anymore. I would just tell you that if I were in the business, and that I would be screaming at top of my lungs about repositioning resources and assets to collect on this, because this is a once in a lifetime chance to get a look at this system before we all die. And because the system stopped, the Russians stopped testing this in 2017. I think that was the last operational test. Then the Russians mothballed the system. And so the RS-26 Rubz has not been on our radar for 7 to 8 years. And now suddenly here it is. And I think the Russians, and you've got to, again, if I were briefing the president, I would say, this is not the action of a madman.
Right.
This is the action of a Russian leader who's desperately trying to prevent this thing from spinning out of control. If this was a madman,
like that thought of this is not the action of a madman gets interpreted through their lens of, oh, he's weak. That it's so dangerous. And I agree with you fully. Lavrov even said in his statement, I am trying to prevent a nuclear war. And it's like, okay, well, how are you trying to prevent a nuclear war? By effectively showing you strength and willingness and credibility. And they don't see it. They just don't seem to see it. I mean, that's the most terrifying aspect of this, Scott.
Well, hopefully they will. Again, this is a wake-up call. I don't know, if they'll listen. But I sent a message out to the Trump transition team this morning, and I said, this has come to Jesus moment, guys. Whatever you think your policy towards Russia is, it has to change right now. You need to start talking to people about the reality of, where Russia is, and most importantly, about the need for arms control.
Yeah.
Even when Donald Trump Jr. and RFK Jr. wrote their op-ed piece for The Hill magazine, talking about a need to bring an end to this conflict in Ukraine and to prevent a nuclear war, there was no mention of arms control. I think right now the Trump administration needs to have a realistic talk about this and how it must lead with arms control, lead with disarmament. And the first thing is to come out and just say that we're abandoning the Biden administration strategy of strategic defeat. We're no longer seeking the strategic defeat of Russia. Therefore, you don't have to fear. And we're willing to put we're talking about mutual reduction. We're not talking about getting, Russia weakening itself. We're talking about working with Russia to lower the threshold. The first step towards disarmament is arms control. Arms control doesn't necessarily mean disarmament. It means stopping the arms race. It means bringing this out of control madness under control, to begin negotiations, to de-escalate, to do things that send signals that we're not leaning forward for nuclear war, we're pushing back. So, disarmament doesn't happen until you have confidence. It's not like we're going to start tomorrow and start cutting weapons. No. But what we need to do is start talking, saying, this is not the right trajectory. Can we both agree on that? And that's what we saw in the 60s and 70s. Before we got to the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was the elimination of an entire class of nuclear weapons, and the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which eliminated, they brought it down from 20,000 down to 1,550, where we are today. Good stuff. But before we got there, we had the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. That is putting a cap on this massive arms race that was taking place, this explosion in the development of nuclear weapons by both the Russians and the Soviets. And so the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty slowed that down. You had SALT 1, boom. SALT 2 slowed it down. And then INF showed you could reduce. We got the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. We started reducing, boom. We're at the stage today where we need something like the Strategic Arms Limitation talks, where we just sit down with the Russians and say, whoa, let's put the brakes on all of this. Let's sit down and talk about where we're at and where we want to go and how we're going to get there. A joint conversation, not us coming in directing or the Russians demanding. No, stop, slow down. Whoa, okay, we're slowed down. Here's where we are. Do we want to be here? No. Where do we want to go? Well, we'd like to be there. How do we get there? And now we get into the talks about treaties and compliance verification mechanisms, things like that. But we're not having that dialogue today. Anatoly Antonov, this brilliant Russian ambassador who served in the United States, just left after 7 years. He was the guy that negotiated the last arms control treaty. He's the guy you want to be the ambassador to the United States right now. But because for 7 years, the United States government wouldn't talk to him, he went home. There's no Russian ambassador in the United States right now. Think about that. Russia just fired an ICBM against Ukraine, and there's no Russian ambassador. He had a defense attaché, a major general, who was a general in the strategic rocket forces of Russia. He is the guy that controls the Rubz. And he was here ready to talk to us about arms control. Nobody talked to him.
But Scott, how does that work in a context where we are massively distrusted and we tend to be just aggressively dishonest? If you think about it, the JCPOA, we pulled out, as you pointed out, we pulled out of all of those nuclear treaties. The way that we've talked about this conflict, unprovoked war, Russia is trying to take over all of Europe, the killing of the Minsk agreements 1 and 2, even the Istanbul agreements being blown off immediately when the deal was on the table. Meaning in the context of all of that stuff taking place, how on earth could Russia trust anything that comes out of the U.S. president? I mean, even one, we won't move an inch to the east. All of these things were violated. Even the overthrow of the Ukrainian government, they called it a revolution of dignity. So, like, how could you even get into a position to trust what is coming out of the U.S. on something like this, to even move to that point of reduction or move to that point of freezing, especially when the next president that comes in could easily blow away anything that was negotiated, just like has taken place over the past administrations?
I mean, every point you raise is valid. I wrote a book, Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika, about the experience of the INF Treaty.
Mhm.
In the book, and one of the reasons why I'm bringing up the book is, we learn from the lessons of the past. And the INF Treaty was negotiated in a time when there was no trust between the United States and the Soviet Union, none whatsoever. They didn't trust us. We didn't trust them. We assumed they cheated on everything. They assumed we cheated on everything. We assumed every time we met them, they were lying. They assumed every time we met, we were lying. I mean, just like today. And yet we sat down and went, we got to change this. We got to change this parameter. And we did. We negotiated a treaty mutually. It dealt with, it was a reciprocal treaty. What happened to them happened to us, mutually verifiable, and it worked. It worked. So I'm saying right now, yeah, there's a bunch of baggage here. There's no doubt about that. And is America going to have to lean over backwards to, I mean, the bottom line is the Russians have said, Anatoly Antonov told me, he said, we don't do arms control. If we do ever do arms control with you again, it's not going to be a resumption of business as usual.
Right.
We're going to need treaties that have measures that lock it in, that make it permanent, regardless of who's president. We're going to need you to put language in that treaty that locks you into this, that you can't just come out and withdraw, because otherwise, why are we doing this? We negotiate a treaty with you, and then 20 years later, you say it's inconvenient to you. No. So, there are parameters, but, Ronald Reagan brought up that old Russian proverb, doveraj no poveraj, trust but verify. And I think the Russians, it's their turn to sit down at the table and go, yeah, we trust, but we're going to have to verify the hell out of this one, guys, because we don't trust you, because you have broken trust, faith in the past, etc. That's okay. That's part of the negotiating process. And the beauty about being involved in negotiations is we're not trying to kill each other while we're talking,
Right.
that we're slowing this down. Is it going to be easy? Absolutely not. It's going to be one of the most difficult processes imaginable. But I always say this too about, somebody who's been in the military, etc. Anytime someone tells me, well, this negotiation is going to be tough, say, well, why don't you pick up a weapon, go to the front line, and call me in about 24 hours after you've gotten no sleep, all your friends are dead, your gut shot, bleeding out, and suddenly doesn't yak, 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 yak sound a hell of a lot better than bang, 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 bang? I mean, all these people talk about how difficult negotiation. Go get shot.
Yeah.
Go get shot and suddenly tell me, oh, it might be better that we had old men talking instead of young men shooting. So in the case of nuclear weapons, man, I want people talking. I want talking to the blue in the face. I don't care if we're pounding the table, screaming at each other. I mean, that's good because that's better than calm people sitting down with a nuclear suitcase open, reading out launch codes. I don't want that. I want people at the table angry, frustrated, throwing things, mad, and then agreeing. We're going to stop talking today. We're going to go home, get drunk, come in tomorrow, and start over again. Good. Because while we're doing that, nobody's punching the launch codes into a ballistic missile to fire it off and kill the world. So are negotiations going to be easy? No. The hardest thing we've ever done, especially given the history that you just talked about. But it's absolutely necessary to say, and I will say this too, whatever you think about Donald Trump, I don't care. This is the point I'm going to make. He's revolutionary. He is the anti-establishment. You talked about how can they ever trust a president because the next one comes in. Understand this, when it comes to arms control and nuclear policy, it doesn't matter who the president is. It's run by the establishment. It's run by the deepest part of the deep state. It is the unelected permanent bureaucracy that doesn't change no matter who is the president. And we finally have a president who said, I'm taking that down.
Yeah.
This is the chance to come in and break the iron grip that the nuclear war establishment has on American defense policy. Trump can do it. This is the opportunity, and there's no better impetus for pushing him in that direction than what just happened.
I want to get your take on something. This is Keir Starmer. I think this is utterly deranged. But I want to get how you view this type of
Just
behavior.
quickly, Russia
Let's see, get it.
has also threatened nuclear escalation. Are you comfortable with that when people at home are watching this, worrying that you could put us at risk?
Well, it's very important. It's very important that we're steadfast in our support for Ukraine. Russia is the aggressor,
Even if
Russia
unleashes nuclear war?
Russia has to be the one that makes the move to stop this war. It's within their gift, but we must support Ukraine. It's impacting not just Ukraine; it's impacting the rest of the world, including the UK.
Is your message to viewers back home that there will not be a nuclear war, because that is what Russia is threatening?
My message is that we need to ensure that Ukraine is put in the best possible position. This is 1,000 days of conflict.
Scott, that seems utterly and completely detached from reality to me. They're asking him point blank, are you willing to end the world over Ukraine? And his answer is apparently yes, because he's not giving her a straight answer, just saying, well, we have to keep supporting Ukraine. We have to keep supporting Ukraine. And people like Macron, I would even say Joe Biden, has effectively taken that stance. That seems utterly detached from reality to me.
But Keir Starmer's stance is premised on the official British government position that Russia's bluffing.
Right.
That's what he said. That's what his defense ministry has said. That's what his intelligence service say. Russia's bluffing. Putin's not going to do this. Quit threatening nuclear war. We know you're not going to do it. You're just posturing. And, Macron has said the same thing. Oh, he's not going to do this. And the United States, we're not worried. We don't see anything happening. Again, I just want to say that for the first time in the history of warfare, an ICBM was fired in anger. This changes everything. I'd like to see Keir Starmer answer that question now.
Well,
and I'd like to see him answer. Pardon?
Well, we're probably going to get it today. I mean, if they fire off additional storm shadow,
What's fascinating in all this, the Russians, I mean, love them or hate them, they provide a PhD class, a level class in diplomacy. The British and the Americans took the position that because before, remember, there was going to be high publicity. Starmer was coming in the White House. Biden was going to sign the authorization, official statements, release. Here they've taken the position of, we're just not going to talk about it. And as Zelensky said, we're going to let the missiles do the talking. Remember that? Zelensky, we're going to let the missiles do the talking. Well, I don't know if you saw Maria Zakharova, who's just the brilliant press spokesman for the Russians, was for the foreign ministry, was getting ready to answer questions, and she got a phone call. And it was a hot mic moment, very sloppy on her part, unless it was deliberate. We'll never know. Because she's so damn professional, I think it was deliberate. And she picked up the phone, and she knew she was on a hot mic. And the person on the other end said, "Maria, we're don't take any questions about the ballistic missile attack. We're not discussing that." She went, "Okay," and then she went on.
Really?
But the point is,
really?
That's just trolling. That's brilliant trolling, because she's too professional. She's too damn professional.
Yeah, that wasn't a mistake.
No, that was done on purpose. But notice, people ask Peskov, the Kremlin, what about this? We're not talking. That's a Ministry of Defense thing. They call the Ministry of Defense. That's a Kremlin thing. Russians to start talking about it. Maybe they're letting
nothing in the media about it.
Maybe they're letting the missile. Maybe they're letting the missile do the talking.
Yeah.
Zelensky's words thrown right back at them.
Let me ask you this: they are going with this argument of a domino theory. They are, and look, it's fun. It's completely ludicrous. But what they're saying is, well, if we don't fight them here, then what does it mean for Taiwan? And what does it mean for forces in these other locations? In fact, I want to go for a slightly different question on this. What is going on in Syria right now? Because there seems to be engagements even taking place in Syria where Russian military is in Syria, the US is in Syria, Turkey has a stake in Syria, and this seems to be utterly chaotic. And I strongly suspect that not only is Russia going to do something like this, it may be likely that the Houthis all of a sudden develop new rocketry technology, an amazing aim in the way that they hit that ship the other day, or groups in Syria may all of a sudden develop new rocketry technology. They may all of a sudden get amazing aim. Give me your take on that. What is taking place in Syria right now in regards to this kind of standoff among these nations?
Well, I mean, it's been this way for some time. Recall that 2011, the CIA undertook Operation.
They're trying to overthrow Assad.
Sycamore, something like that. I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's the covert operation to get rid of Bashar al-Assad.
Right.
You remember Muammar Gaddafi fell. The CIA immediately started shipping arms from Libya into Turkey to bring it into Syria to equip the Free Syrian, what they call the Free Syrian Army, which is a CIA-trained group of defectors. Saudi Arabia and Qatar started underwriting Islamic groups, Al-Qaeda and other Salafist groups. The United States did nothing to prevent the rise of ISIS because we viewed that as a perfect way of bringing down Assad. And Syria almost collapsed in 2014. Right. It was almost the end. The black flag of Islam almost flew over Damascus. Qasem Soleimani, a name that people might remember, he was the Iranian leader that Trump assassinated in 2020. Qasem Soleimani flew to Moscow and met with the Russians and said, "Look, you have to intervene. We're coming in and we're doing what we can, but we need decisive intervention that only Russia can bring." And in 2015, at the invitation of the Syrian government, Russia deployed air forces and limited ground forces to Syria, which not only stabilized the situation but turned the tables on them. Since that time, the United States, has intervened. We occupy 1/3 of Syria. Turkey has intervened because the United States made allies with Kurdish forces that the Turks consider to be terrorists. So the Turks have intervened, and you just have this situation where the Syrian government has stabilized itself. It's backed by the Russians, but 1/3 of its country is occupied by the United States, which no longer has a viable anti-Assad posture. So we don't know why we're there, but Turkey's saying get out too, and so.
It's just
could there be a situation where there's a qualitative improvement in the weapon systems of anti-American Syrian militias, anti-American Iraqi militias? The answer is yes, there will be. Could the Houthi suddenly find themselves in possession of Onyx anti-shipping missiles? I think they will. But the Russians have to play this. The Russians are, again, smarter than the average dog. And for all the Russians listening, that's not meant to be an insult. That's meant to be a compliment. When your enemy's losing, don't get in the way of their defeat.
Right, let them lose.
The United States is losing. And remember, Russia looks at things that go beyond simply troops on the ground. They're looking at geopolitical posturing, what the balance of power, the correlation of power is going to be post-American involvement in Syria. How do they maximize this? And it's not just about making America diminished in the region, but Russia is concerned about Iran having too much influence and the destabilizing impact that would have on Israel. So Russia's playing a very complicated game here, balancing sides off against the other, including Turkey, wanting to be strategic allies with Turkey, but not giving Turkey too much, leverage here and there. The Russians are very, very, very patient and very, very, very clever. And they don't think tactically, they think strategically. And I think that's the problem, because in the West, we tend to look at it and say, well, on a day-to-day basis. Oh, a militia attacked us today. We've now got a posture to respond to that militia. That's all that matters. And the Russians just look at that and say, that's America losing control. We're just going to let it happen.
Yes, posturing, hubris, all that stuff.
Russia has to be careful when we talk about the qualitative improvement in weaponry, that Russia doesn't push it too far to get America to
respond.
Stop talking about leaving, instead talk about reinforcing. So the Russians are playing, and again, we in the West interpret Russian patience as Russian weakness.
Right.
But the fact is, because the American response is to send an aircraft wing, fly airplanes over, and say, "Hey, look how strong we are." And the Russian thing is, okay, you do that, but that just cost you $5 billion that you don't have. You've postured. We're just going to wait a month and a half, and you're going to send those forces home because you didn't get the fight you wanted, and now you're bankrupt, and we're still where we were. We're stronger now. That's the Russian approach.
Scott, 30 seconds. Are you concerned that this gets out of control before Trump gets in office?
Yes, I'm very concerned that this gets out of control because I don't have any faith and confidence in the Biden administration to accept the message that Russia's put on the table. We need decisive intervention by the Trump transition team right now. I know the Logan Act and precedent argues against it, but Trump needs to tell Biden, the American people spoke on November 5th. They said no to your policies. They said yes to me coming in and fixing things. And now you're trying to screw things up. That's violating the mandate given to me by the American people, and I won't stand for it. And he really needs to come out and speak forcefully, not just to the American people and to the Biden administration, but to the Russians, and let them know that there will be changes on January 20th, that regardless of what Biden's doing now, Trump isn't going to be doing. He needs to articulate this so that the Russians understand that there will be a difference between post-January 20th and what's going on right now.
Scott, I agree with everything that came out of your mouth, man. Thank you for this. I really appreciate it. You greatly appreciate it. Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector and weapons of mass destruction whistleblower. You can follow Scott on Telegram at Scott Ritter. And of course, as he pointed out, he has books. You can pick up his books also. Thank you for this, man. I really appreciate it. I definitely appreciate your point of view. All right.
Thank you.